Hi, Grandma here with Crispin by Avi. Well, there were some interesting things that happened in the previous chapters, but one that I kind of wanted to talk about was Bear's idea about God. Crispin thinks that Bear is crazy. He calls him mad because of his opinions about God and the church. What is it that Bear believes in as far as God and the church? Does he believe that the church is important, that the priest is important, that holding a cross while you're praying is important? Or does he believe that God is inside you and a part of your heart? While the idea that God is everywhere and anyone can pray to God anytime they want to is a pretty common belief today. It was not 350 years ago. The priests and the churches were very powerful. In some cases, they were more powerful than the kings. So what he was suggesting to Crispin would be considered heresy. And do you know what they did to heretics 350 years ago? Well, one heretic that you may know about is Joan of Arc. Does anybody know what happened to Joan of Arc? She was burned at the stake, and so death is for sure one of the penalties for being a heretic. But we're going to begin chapter 27. And they are on their way to Great Wexley and looking forward to performing in the next village. Chapter 27. Next morning we set off at dawn and soon were trudging along the dirt road. At that place it meandered among low hills so that we never had a clear view for very far. Only through the tree breaks did we catch glimpses of open fields. We'd been going a little while when Bear abruptly halted. "What's the matter?" I said. "Look." He pointed to the sky. I saw nothing but a flock of wood pigeons, swirling high above, some ways beyond where we were. "The pigeons?" I said. "They're agitated about something." "What?" "We'd best find out," he said. "Stay close." Straight away he loped off the road and I followed. He led me into a small spinney, ample enough to hide us from view. Once there he spied out. Without speaking, he pointed toward a hill some ways across the nearest field. When I nodded my understanding, he ran toward it. I kept close. Upon reaching the base of the hill, he dropped upon his hands and knees, motioning that I should leave the sack behind. He began to crawl toward the hill crest. When he reached it, he pulled off his cap, then lifted his head just above the summit. After gazing a while, he turned slightly, beckoned me closer, and whispered, "Look, but be careful not to show yourself." Cautiously, I raised my head. What I saw before me was the road we'd been traveling on, but somewhat farther along. At a place that had been hidden from our view was a small plank bridge spanning a river. Some 12 men were loitering about. A few were sitting on the ground. Others stood by the bridge. All were armed with swords and long bows. It was as if they were waiting for someone. Among them was one I recognized. "Bear," I whispered, my heart pounding. "It's John Aycliffe, the steward of Stromford village." Bear looked at me, but in a different way than he had before. Then at the men again. After a few more moments, he backed away. Pulling at my arm, he bade me follow. We went part way down the hill to a place where we could not be seen. Once there, he sat in silence while I waited anxiously for him to tell me what to do. "Crispin," he said with the utmost solemnity, "mortal men are never perfect. In my life, I've done things I'm ashamed of. Things that the all-seeing God shall see emblazoned on my soul. You said They proclaimed you a wolf's head because you stole. You deny you were a thief. It's not for me to punish you, God awaits, but I must know the absolute truth by all that's sacred. Did or did you not do what they say you did? The way he spoke distressed me. Even so, I only said, no. He sighed and shook his head. Oh, I believe you, but it makes no sense. They should be glad you fled. At best, you're a nuisance. Why are they searching so hard for you? He wondered out loud. And why should they think or care that you're headed for Great Wexley? How do they even know? Oh, this is the only road, he explained. Have you anything to say to this? I told you they would come after me. You were right. I should have listened more, but Crispin, there must be something more here, more than you know. Whatever satisfaction I had in hearing him admit that I was right paled when I saw his alarm. What are we going to do? I said. Well, we'll go no further along this road, he said. That's certain. But I must go forward. We'd better strike across there, he said, pointing beyond the field towards some outlying woods. It'll take us far away from these men and your steward. Without further ado, he arose and marched off with great strides. I rushed to keep up, more than once looking back. As we went along, I kept thinking how Bear had noticed the birds, which allowed him to see the soldiers. If, I told myself, I was to stay alive in this new world, I must learn such skills as he had. The sooner I learned, I told myself, the longer my life. Chapter 28. For the rest of the day, we made our way without the benefit of roads. A few times we came upon narrow paths, and these we followed, but only for short times. Instead, Bear went this way, now that, following no reason that I could grasp other than we moved further and further from the steward. As we went, he hardly spoke. Do you know where you're going? I finally said. Well, to where you can remain alive, he replied. It was dusk when he finally allowed us to stop. Rain had begun to fall. The dismal drizzle caused the overhanging leaves to drip with irritating monotony. Before a low and flaring fire, which sputtered to the ground, we ate 2 small pigeons Bear had managed to snare. Perhaps to shift my mind from my worries, he showed me how he did his snaring, using a few long strands of horsetail hair that he kept in his bag. After tying the strands together, he made them into a loop, which enabled him to trap with great cunning the birds without them even knowing they were in danger. I was much engaged. After eating, we stayed on opposite sides of the fire, taking what warmth we could. Bear was in a solemn mood and spoke very little, seemingly preoccupied with his thoughts. Do you believe me now? I said. About what? That they're looking for me. Yes, he said. I lay back and recalled what had happened in the forest at Stromford. Bear, I said, sitting up, I remember something else. What? The man the steward met had a horse, a fine one. He must have been a man of wealth. Bear only shrugged. Then I said, I wish I knew what the document was that the stranger brought to John Aycliffe. Though even if I had seen it, I couldn't have read it. Oh, by and by I'll teach you, he said. Bear? Yes, lad, he said sleepily. I have remembered something else. Before I left, the priest told me my mother could read and write. How could a miserable peasant woman acquire such skills? I don't know. I never saw her do so, but Father Quinnell insisted it was true. Did he teach her? He didn't say, but he insisted it was she who wrote on my cross. Bear rubbed his face and beard, then rolled down onto his back. Enough, he said. We'd best sleep if we intend to survive. We'll need to find a village soon. As usual, before I lay down, I fetched the cross from the pouch around my neck and placed it between my hands, when I, upon my knees, began to pray. "Crispin!" I heard Bear cry out. I looked around. "Give me that cross!" Remembering that what he had said about crosses and concerned that he might do it some harm, I said, "I'd rather not." "Give it!" he roared. "It's precious to me," I said, holding it back. "By God's honest heart," he said, "I won't do it any harm." "Do you truly vow?" "By the bloody hands of Christ," he said. Though reluctant, I gave him what he wanted. Taking the cross in his great hands, where it seemed even smaller than it was, he peered at it with shrewd eyes, even feeling it with his fingers. Next, he brought it near to the fire. Knowing that lead could melt in fire, I cried, "Don't cast it away!" Paying me no attention, he held the cross in his palm in such a way that it was illuminated by our little fire, while he squinted at it closely. I realized then he was looking at the words. "Can you read what it says?" I asked. He did not reply. Instead, he handed the cross back to me. "Oh, the light is too weak," he said, "and I need my sleep." With that, he rolled onto his back and closed his eyes. I looked at him and at the cross, certain he'd found a meaning that he was not prepared to tell. What do you think? Do you think he was able to read what was on the cross? And what do you think was written on the cross? Chapter 29. In the morning, Bear was much subdued. Now and again, as we prepared to go, I caught him glancing at me when he thought I would not notice. He said nothing, however, and I decided not to ask. I knew him well enough by then to know that he'd speak only when he chose. We set off over hills and through woods until at last he came upon a narrow, winding path. Here Bear paused. "We'll go this way," he announced. "It will lead us somewhere." Sure enough, by mid-morning we heard the distant tolling of a bell. We stopped. "There must be a village a league or so ahead," Bear cautioned. "Can you remember everything I told you about how we should enter such a place?" "I think so." "Okay, try your tunes," he said. I took out the recorder and played. He listened intently. "Good," he said. "You've learned well enough. We'll prosper as long as you do as I've taught you." Rare for him. He seemed nervous. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Crispin," he said solemnly, "if there is any trouble, ever, you're not to pay any mind to me. Just run." "Run?" I said, taken aback. "From what?" "If anyone should try to harm or apprehend you." "But where would I go?" He thought for a moment. "As far north as you can." "Why there?" "You'll be safest out of the kingdom." "But aren't we going to Great Wexley?" "We are. On the 23rd of June, the eve of the feast of St. John the Baptist." "Why then?" I asked. "It's Midsummer Day. The city will be crowded with a large market and festivities. That's always good for mummers. We should do well, and as I told you, I have some matters with a man." "What man?" He ruffled his beard. "Oh, it's a private matter." Then he added, as if to mollify me, "I've promised to be there, and so I must." He was being evasive again, as when I'd asked him about the writing on the cross. "There's more, isn't there?" "Oh, Crispin, I'm part of a brotherhood. It's to make things better, to bring some change." "Nothing really changes," I said, thinking he had misspoken. He looked at me with a smile. "Well, have you not changed?" "A little," I admitted. "Crispin, I merely wish to bring some of that freedom you seek." He studied the sky as if some answer might be there, but I fear the time isn't ready. "You expect some hazard, don't you?" Though I knew he heard my question. He acted as if he hadn't. "Is there some danger for me?" I pressed. "Oh, by St. Pancras," he said, "I was surprised when we saw that gathering waiting for you at the bridge." "That's for me. What about you?" He shrugged. "I never fear for myself." "Why?" "I make my own choices." "Then do you fear for me there?" Perhaps." "Why?" "Crispin, when it comes to the affairs of men, I only worry about what I cannot understand." "And?" "I can't make sense of your innocence. In a ruthless world, I find innocence more a puzzle than evil." "Must we go there, then?" "Crispin, I told you I promised the Brotherhood that in my travels I'd survey the kingdom, that I would bring them the judgment of my observations. I try to keep my word. They're waiting for me." He picked up some dirt and rubbed it between his hands. "I must give them the benefit of my judgment, that's all." "You read the writing on my cross," I said. "What did it say?" He offered me a wry smile. "Crispin, if we wish to survive, it's time for us to go to work." "Bear." "Enough," he said with sudden authority, and turned away. Chapter 30. It was not long before we approached the wooded outskirts of a little village. Its name was Lodgecot, as we would later learn. When we came out from the trees, we saw cultivated fields. Men, women, and children were hard at work, just as at Stromford, plowing, weeding, hoeing. The clothes they wore could have come right from my home, too. Here and there, sheep and cattle grazed. I found it a marvel that I could see so much of the world, yet find it much the same. As we passed the fields, people paused in their work to look at us. At first, Bear ignored them. Only when we drew closer to the village itself did he pause and scrutinize what lay ahead. "I don't see any trouble," he said. I looked around. "What kind of trouble?" I asked. "Oh, the people looking for you. Now play." Though nervous, I put the pipe in my mouth and began to make music. Even as I did, Bear began his dance. So it was that we entered the village. If the village of Lodgecot had been exchanged with Stromford, I don't think that the world would have noticed. It contained the same cluster of small dwellings along a single rough road with but one or two structures larger than the rest. Every house was roofed with thatch and had walls of wattle and daub. A stone church with a stubby tower stood close to the village center. On a low hill, not far away, I spied a manor house. It was larger than the other houses, but not very much. As we came into the village proper, dogs, pigs, and children approached us with a snuffling curiosity. They made sure to keep their distance. It was harder to say who was dirtier, the children or the beasts. When women emerged from the cottages to stare at us guardedly, keeping their younger children behind their skirts, one of these women had a whispered exchange with a child who promptly raced off toward the church. Remembering what I had been told, I, still playing my music, headed straight for the church too. Even as we approached it, a priest emerged, no doubt alerted by the child. He was a younger man than Father Quinnell, short, thin, with large round eyes and the stubble of an ill-shaved beard. He did not appear very clean. His robes were quite soiled. Frowning, he stood before the church doors, hands clasped before him. I stepped aside and let Bear approach. He danced right up to where the priest stood, and then, to my astonishment, halted, sank to his knees, pulling off his cap. I stopped playing and hoped my unease did not show. "Most Reverend Father," Bear said in his voice loud enough so all onlookers might hear, "I, known as Bear, am a juggler. My son and I have made our way from the city of York, going toward Canterbury to perform sacred penance. We do humbly beseech your blessing." The priest visibly softened. "My boy and I beg your gracious permission to perform some simple songs and dances for the greater glory of God, for this village, and for his grace, King Edward of England, warrior king. with whom I had the honor of fighting on the victorious fields of France." Then Bear bowed his head, but tilted it somewhat sideways so he could keep an eye on me. I think he even winked. The priest looked at Bear, then at me, then at Bear again. "Well, do you know sacred songs?" "I do," said Bear. Hands clapped together in prayer, he began to sing, "Mary, maiden gracious and free, vessel of the Trinity, who graciously listens unto me, as I grant thee with my song, though my feet unclean be, and my hopes remain unborn, thou art the queen of paradise, of heaven and of earth and all that is, that giveth birth to the King of bliss, without a sin or a sore, putting it right to all who are poor, winning life for us evermore." At the conclusion of his song, Bear bowed his head, crossed himself, and clasped his hands over his chest. The image of humility. The priest was clearly pleased. Smiling, he raised his hands over Bear's head and pronounced a blessing. At this, Bear jumped up and nodded to me. I took it to be a signal to resume my playing, which I did with gusto. It was not long before most of the townspeople had gathered round us in a great circle. Off to one side, I played the music while Bear performed in the center. Midway through his dance, he gathered up his leather balls and began to juggle. I could hear the oohs and the ahs from the crowd as Bear added first a third ball, then a fourth. Then when he stepped forward and snatched a mazer from the hands of one of the onlookers and added it to the revolving mix, there was laughter and applause. Now remember that if you go back to page 309, there's a glossary of words. So if you didn't know what mazer was, you can look it up. A large drinking bowl made of water. The young man from whom he'd taken the mazer was a small, one-eyed youth. He wore a patch over his other eye. He also had a thin, scraggly beard that seemed designed to proclaim him older than he was. Though others roared at Bear's antics, the young man took offense at Bear's gambols, and with growing anger made 3 attempts to snatch his mazer back. Each time Bear, with great dexterity, seemed to offer him the mazer, but at the last moment tossed it high. This was done to the great hilarity of the crowd, but to the increasing resentment of the young man. Finally, muttering curses under his breath, the young man stormed away. No one seemed to care. Attentive to what I'd been taught, I approached Bear, still dancing and juggling. He inclined his head to allow me to remove his cap. I took it. Holding it before me, I moved about, saying nothing but begging for coins. To my great delight, we received a few pennies as well as some bread. When Bear was finally done and stood all in a sweat, people gathered around him. Even his children surrounded me and pelted me with questions. "What's your name? Where are you from? Where are you going? How'd you learn such things? Is your father the biggest man in the world?" were among the questions I was asked. I started to respond honestly, but caught myself and gave another name, another place, and as for Bear remembering what he'd said, I claimed him for my father. At length Bear called me to his side. Led by the priest, who was nothing but smiles now, we entered the church. Many from the village followed us inside. One of them, I noticed, was the one-eyed young man who had returned. He gazed at Bear with such malevolence, I thought he might offer harm. The church was like my own at Stromford, though with different imagery on the walls. In particular, there was a vision of Jesus harrowing hell, the demons frightening to behold. Before the altar, both Bear and I knelt, at least I prayed. "But where will you be going next?" the priest asked afterward. The onlookers seemed as interested in our answer as was the priest. "Oh, to Great Wexley for the fair on the feast of John the Baptist," Bear returned, "but always toward Canterbury," he added. "There are many villages hereabout," the priest informed us, "but You need to be on the alert for a notorious murderer." I'd been gazing at the images on the wall. Now I turned to listen. "What do you mean?" Bear said to the priest. "At a village north of here, I'm not sure which, a boy went mad. After robbing the manor house, he killed a priest." I hastily looked down lest I give myself away, but as I shifted, I became aware that the one-eyed young man was staring right at me. "Oh, God mend all!" Bear cried with horror, making the sign of the cross. "Can they find him?" "No one knows where he's fled," the priest said. "But an official came here along with a troop of armed men. They say the youth is very dangerous. He's been declared a wolf's head. There's a 20-shilling reward for his taking, dead or alive." "Oh, I'm grateful for your warning," Bear said, stony-faced. "We would love to earn that money. Who is your lord here?" "Lord Fornival," the priest replied, "and though he's been gone for 14 years, we've received word that, give thanks to God, though gravely ill, he's at last returned to England. We pray daily that he may recover and that we may see him soon." "Oh, God is kind to those who love him," Bear said. "How did you learn the news?" "Oh, he sent a courier, a man named Dubray." With many gracious words, Bear took leave of the priest. Then he mingled with the townspeople and asked them many questions about their crops, their harvests, the life they led. And though I wished desperately to speak to him, I kept away. Well, that is certainly an interesting chapter. Do you remember the name Dubray? He was the man on the horse that was dressed very finely that brought the document to Aylward. And who do you think is the person they're looking for the murder of Father Quinnell? Crispin. That's why they are still on the road looking for him. Is because Aylward has told everyone that he murdered the priest. Now remember what I told you about the church and how important the church and priests were. That would be a very, very grave sin at any time to murder a priest, but especially back then. That would be like somebody assassinating a king. So, that's all for today. Bye-bye.